Okay, great. Well, thank you all for coming today. My name is Jake Carlson. I am the Director of Deep Blue Repository and Research Data Services at the University of Michigan Library, and I'm really pleased to be hosting this presentation done by Sharon Glotzer's research group. So I'm really excited about our presentation today. I've had the opportunity to work with Joshua, Karen, and other members of the Glotzer research team before, and I've always been impressed with the amount of thought and dedication that they give to data management and reproducibility issues. As you'll hear shortly, the research they do is quite complex and it generates a great deal of data. And they, like most other grant recipients, are required to create a 2-page data management plan describing the data management practices and sharing practices. And for many labs, this 2-page data management plan is the extent of their investment into developing good data management practices. And given the pressures they face, this is really understandable. You know, the minimal goal for any research lab is to develop practices that enable them to use the data to get their work done and to publish their findings in a reasonably timely manner. And so developing good data management practices that go above and beyond the immediate internal needs is really a complex effort that requires a significant investment of time and effort, not to mention some comfort with changing practices and perhaps trying something new. It may not also be immediately or clear as to what the benefits might be to making this kind of investment. So what you'll hear today is one lab's work to build a data management system that closely aligns with and supports their research. But more than just thinking about their needs, they've developed tools that can be adopted and used by other labs to aid them in addressing their own data management and reproducibility needs. In addition, they'll talk a bit about the impact their investment in thinking about reproducibility and developing these tools has had on their work and how it's enhanced their professional reputation. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Joshua Anderson to start the presentation. I do want to mention that we'll be saving questions for the end of the presentation. If you do have questions along the way, feel free to type them into chat, and I'll be happy to read them once the presentation is done. I think we'll try unmuting folks who have questions and letting them ask directly to the Zoom window, but it doesn't work for whatever reason, we can go back to chat. So with that, let me turn it over to Joshua.
All right, thank you for that introduction. Tim, can you share the slides? There we go. All right, so thanks for that introduction, Jake. So this, you can see here a picture of Glotzer Group. We are a rather large research group, all doing computational research in the chemistry department and chemical engineering department, sorry. I am a research staff member. I've been with the group for 11 years. And before I joined the group, the senior students and postdocs would have a process of passing their code down to new students. Sorry for the background noise. Would have a process of passing their code down to new students in the group who would modify that code and use it to undertake new research, and this process repeated over the years. The codes were typically serial and internal to the group. And when I joined the group 11 years ago, I brought a fast GPU-accelerated Python scriptical code to the group that we now use to, the whole group uses, along with other codes we've built over the years to do our research. Next slide. So the type of research that we do is molecular simulation, self-assembly studies. We specifically focus on colloidal and nanoscale materials where particle shape or other interactions between building blocks lead to complex self-assembled structures. For instance, we're interested in polyhedral particles, systems that form quasicrystals, active matter, and others. We work with experimentalists who realize these systems in the lab, but we are a computational group, and so everything we do is molecular simulation and analysis of those results. As a group we use millions of CPU and GPU hours every year on HPC resources such as Great Lakes, NSF Exceed machines, and Summit at OLCF, currently the #2 supercomputer on the top 500 list. Many of our studies explore large regions in phase space, where we look at changing parameters of the model and how that can influence the structures that result. And we can do this sort of high throughput type approach and find areas of particular interest to experimentalists. So So this is a long talk. Here's a brief outline. I'm going to spend some time introducing the codes that we use to do this research. And one of those codes is Zenyac, which is a workflow data management tool. And we're going to give you a brief introduction to this. So even if you're not in our field of computational materials studies, Signiak is probably the one tool that we developed that you might find most interesting. So we're going to briefly talk about that. And then we'll follow up with 2 case studies of how we're applying these tools to do reproducible science. Next slide. So the types of systems that we model as a group, we're always pushing the boundaries of our community. So as a result, other codes that exist out there that don't really have the functionalities we need to model the types of systems that we're interested in. So out of necessity, we write our own codes to enable our research. But in order to make our research reproducible, we make our codes open source so that others can reproduce our work or use it in their own research and expand it in different directions. So far, we have currently have 13 open source Python packages that we've released in our group. These all interoperate within the scientific Python ecosystem, such as NumPy, SciPy, Jupyter, and other tools like that. We use a Unix philosophy for developing these packages. So we make many small focus packages, as you can see on the left. The dark blue panels are the tools, some of the tools we've developed. And this panel is showing how the tools fit together for simulation, analysis, visualization, etc. So each tool has a specific focus of the specialty that it works on, and they're just designed to fit together. So you can use all these tools together the way that we design them to work and use them ourselves, or you can pick out individual tools and use them individually. They work just fine both ways. The 3 main tools, the biggest tools we develop are HumDBlue, Freud, and Signiak. So HumDBlue is that simulation engine I mentioned earlier. It's the software that actually executes the simulation of all those particles interacting. Freud is an analysis toolkit that looks at the trajectory output of the simulation and looks for, can help us understand when order structures are forming and what types of order structures they are. And Signiak, I already mentioned in the previous slide, is our data management and workflow framework. In total, all of our packages are more than 200,000 lines of code. More than 100 people have contributed to them, both inside the group and external to the group. And we've enabled more than 300 research papers by our own group and those in the external community. So my notes. Okay, I'm gonna make this up. Okay, so we use professional software engineering practices in order to, so that our codes will be usable by a wide variety of people and will have reproducible results. We use Git repositories and a pull request workflow. Specifically, all of our codes are hosted on GitHub. And this is pretty much standard practice in the community these days, but I do want to point out that we've been doing this since before GitHub even existed. Source code revision control tools and a variety of different types of workflows for managing multiple developers have existed for a long time. We put a lot of careful thought into our API design and documentation so that our tools will have general applicability in a number of situations and that they are extendable. We also put a lot of work into making tutorials so that new users to our codes can access them and understand how to use them quickly. We extensively unit test our code. So automated unit testing where you just run a command and it executes all the tests in the repository and gives a green checkbox if everything's running fine. We use those in all of our codes to ensure not only that the codes operate correctly, but that we combine that with continuous integration. So every commit to the Git repository will run these tests in the cloud and will notify us when tests are passing or failing. So we can make sure that as we release new versions, all of the old tests still pass. And that helps ensure that new versions of the codes can still produce the same results as the old versions. Also to provide some amount of stability from version to version for users of our codes, we employ a technique called semantic versioning. This is where there's a major, minor, and patch release number. Patches only fix bugs. Minor releases can add new features, but you still promise that version 2.3 will be able to run the same scripts that 2.0 did. And only when you increment that major number and you go from version 2 to version 3 do you break changes. And unlike tools you might be familiar with like Firefox and Chrome, where every release is a new major release that breaks everything, we try to keep major releases alive for several years so that users can continue to reproduce work that they've done years ago. Next slide. So we just putting the source code out there isn't enough. You need to have the packages deployed in systems so that users can download and access the code, and so that they can run it. In the Python community, there's the Python package index. We post most of our codes to that platform. It has certain limitations with binary C++ built packages. So we also work with, have put our packages up on Anaconda Cloud, specifically through the Conda Forge project. We also provide our tool set through containers in Docker and Singularity. And these containers provide a full, something that looks like one file that gives you the full software stack and all of its dependencies, including the Linux operating system. So this gives you a tremendous amount of reproducibility and the ability to, I can hand someone a container that I used to do my research, and they can run with exactly the same software, exactly the same versions, and all that, and it's transportable to an extent from machine to machine. Singularity works on HPC systems so that you can take advantage of the high performance networks and GPUs on those systems. And you can use the same container on Great Lakes or on an NSF Exceed machine or elsewhere, and you get a consistent environment across that. Next slide. So we also do a lot of outreach to make our codes, to get our codes out in the community. We publish all of our novel algorithm and implementation details. We publish in a variety of journals I've listed here. I won't read the names for you. Some codes, especially HUMD, our biggest code, we have many publications on specific features. Other codes, we might just have a single publication we put out there just to give a citable publication for the code. And we've done some of these for smaller codes in the Journal of Open Source Software, which has a much lower bar to publication than the bigger name journals. We track how many times our articles are cited. We track the number of users on our mailing lists, how many people are reading our documentation online, and how many times our software is downloaded to get an idea of our user base. We also go to national conferences and provide workshops and tutorials to get the word on our code more and to present it to our community. Next slide. So you might imagine putting together this whole package requires a large amount of development effort, but we are a large group, so we have a lot of people that are involved in this. And so here on this slide, I'm showing you the people who are the maintainers of the projects. The list of contributors is much longer, but these maintainers, I lead the team using a large fraction of my time as a full-time staff member, but I also lead the development of several of our codes. And the students and postdocs, though, are really what enable us to produce so many quality codes. They provide a lot of leadership and maintain the codes in the group. And each one oversees a specific project or projects. As you see here, some of these faces show up more than once because they have maintainer roles in several projects. The, the project leads, they provide a vision and direction for the project. And then they work with the contributors both inside and outside the group to develop and improve the codes. Students graduate and move on, and so we have a continual process of recruiting and training first year students in the groups and start getting the next generation of these lead developers and maintainers to take up that role later in their student career. We also have hackathons. You can see in the lower left a picture of a hackathon where we get everyone in the group. So whether they're a lead developer on a tool, or if they're someone who has no code development experience at all and who just joined the group, we get them all to join in on a hackathon and to work on some coding project to get the whole group experience with development and get involved in the team projects. We have funding from several, currently we have funding from 2 NSF grants to fund this work, a CDSNE DMR to fund Hindi development, and we're part of a multi-university CSSI to develop reproducible simulations and workflows. That's not enough to build all of the tools that we need, and so certain research projects might need a specific feature, and the student that develops that feature at the time is funded on the grant that funds the science. Signiak is also a NumFocus affiliated project. NumFocus is a nonprofit that supports open source scientific projects with large communities, such as NumPy and Matplotlib you may have heard of. And this affiliation helps Signiak with a number of things that just need to be done to maintain a project. One of the things is they have sponsored a Google Summer of Code, and so there's 2 Google Summer of Code students working on Signiak. Next slide. So what do we mean by reproducibility? We strive to make all of our work reproducible, and as an example, I'll give you an example where we point a researcher in our field to a data set that we posted to Deep Blue Data, and we have, say, 10,000 different simulation runs in this data set. So we expect them to find that data transparent, which means that they can read and search through the metadata, understand the parameters for each run, understand the data. We expect them to be able to reproduce that whole entire data set from scratch, given just the parameters. So they should be able to download the software and the scripts that come along with the data set and be able to rerun all the simulations from scratch, provided that they have enough compute resources to do so. Alternatively, if they have another preferred software package that can run these simulations, they should be able to translate the parameters into their software and run them that way. The data should be usable by others, so that it's stored in documented or community standard formats where they can read and understand the data and metadata and scripts. And it should be extensible. So if you wanted to take this data set and add additional parameters, or change the simulation protocol and see if that changes the results, or just take the data that's already there and analyze it in a new way, our data sets should be extensible in that way. And that's what we aim for. And I will note that this TRUE acronym here, we didn't invent it. It's one of our collaborators in the CSSI grant that you can see the reference in the bottom. Next slide. So of all of our codes, Signiak is the most widely applicable in a wide range of computational experimental use cases. So we'll go into a little bit detail next on how Signiak works to enable that. I will hand it off to Tim for that discussion.
All right, cool. Can everyone hear me? I can't see any responses. So
yeah, we're good. I can hear you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so hey, I'm Tim. I'm a postdoc in the Glotzer lab, and today I'm going to tell you about that tool that Josh introduced to help with reproducible workflows, which we call Signiak. So I will start by posing a question. How do you organize your data for a computational research project? You may consider doing some parameter study over several different concentrations for, say, a molecular simulation. And you might store your data and the data points in separate directories for your whole study. And you might encode the metadata about each data point in the directory name. You might have something like this, where you have the concentration and then the values listed. You may decide to make it hierarchical to make things a little simpler, and you can make the names shorter as you move on. And then all of a sudden you realize you need to run at a new temperature. So this is extending your data space a little bit. So to keep things nice and orderly, you go back and you rename everything, and you try to keep everything consistent still. So you add that variable to your hierarchy. And then you might reorganize things to make it a little more straightforward. And then you might realize that, okay, we need to study a new parameter, another component in the system, maybe component B. So this is certainly all manageable with just a handful of ad hoc bash scripts. But I hope you see that this gets messy pretty quickly. When you're doing research, you're often exploring new parameter spaces, which can give you an inhomogeneous data space. And this makes it non-trivial to kind of search through your data and reorganize your data. And if you're doing this with just some bash scripts, you run the risk of losing data or losing where your data comes from or the data provenance. So I'm going to tell you about the solution that the Glotzer lab has taken to solve this problem. First, I'll explain a little bit about how Signiak works, and then tell you why we took this approach. So Signiak is our solution to this data management problem. And the way it works is so each data point in your study has associated metadata, like I said. So you might have temperature and different concentrations. And we call this metadata about each data point a state point. So each state point lives somewhere on this parameter space. And what we do is we combine state points with the data associated with that state point into what we call a job. Now, a collection of jobs, represented by this white bubble here, makes up a Signiak project. And to keep things flat, the data organization flat, so you don't have a complicated hierarchy, we run a hash function on this metadata to generate a unique identifier for each job. And this allows you to neatly store a very complex parameter space in a simple manner, in a very flat manner. So the reason we took this approach instead of using something out of a package that might have already existed, there's two primary reasons. The first is we want it to be simple, something someone can take and start working with right away. And Zenyac is completely implemented in Python. So if you have a working Python implementation, you can start using Zenyac today. Another reason we took this approach and developed something from the ground up is that we wanted something that lives on the file system. We do a lot of our work on different resources. So we didn't want to have to worry about running, say, a database on all these different resources that we use. So the fact that Signiak projects live on the file system makes it really easy to sync between your different resources. So that's how we manage our data. Of course, research is more than just managing data. You have to interact with the data as well. So the solution that we use to interact with our data is what we call Signiak Flow, workflow management. And what Signiak Flow allows you to do is to write operations that operate on those jobs that I mentioned. So for a molecular simulation, you might have operations that generate data, so maybe run the simulation, and then process that data, calculate some quantities from your output, and then analyze the data and try to get insight from those from that data. So within Signiak Flow, you can define operations, pre and post, conditions that dictate whether or not a given job is eligible for a given operation. And this condition and operation kind of schema completely defines your computational workflow. Additionally, it enforces that the same script is run on each job. So if you're doing things, say with a handful of bash scripts and copying things around to different directories, it's really easy to change just one parameter in one of those scripts and forgot that you did that. And then that simulation is then different than all of your other simulations, which can give you an inconsistent data space, which of course is not good for reproducibility. So a lot of the work we end up doing is not just on our local machines. We use a lot of external computational resources like Josh mentioned. And a lot of these resources you interact with through a queuing system or a scheduler. So to make it simple to migrate between those different resources, Signiak Flow has automatic environment detection. And what this means is when you go to run your operation, you tell Signiak Flow you're going to submit your operations to run, and it'll generate those scripts, those PBS or torque scripts for you to interact with the scheduler, taking a lot of the guesswork out of how to manage your workflow. What this does is it makes it really straightforward to migrate between different compute environments. So you often will get something tested out and running on your local workstation, and then maybe test the scale up to a small cluster or somewhere in the cloud. And then eventually you're going to do your production runs on some of these world's fastest supercomputers that Josh mentioned. And Signiak Flow makes this process fairly seamless. So that's my quick introduction to Signiak. I will close by saying that Signiak not only enables true research, this true paradigm that Josh mentioned, but it makes it really tough to do research that isn't true. So you can export Signiak Project and its associated data, its Workspace, which gives someone else a transparent view into your data. You have a whole workflow defined. So in principle, your project should be reproducible. The way Signiak makes things searchable and indexable, it lives on the file system, it's increases the usability. And someone can pretty straightforwardly take your Python functions and extend them to do new research with them. So to learn more about Signiak, check out these URLs that are posted. There's signiak.io, as well as our GitHub page. So you can go and read more about the Signiak project and how it works, as well as getting started guides. So like Josh mentioned, Signiak is a NUM-focused affiliated project, which helps ensure the longevity of the project. And again, I'll also emphasize that Signiak is not just for molecular simulation folks. We have people in mechanical engineering that use Signiak to manage their data from experiments. And one of our lead developers, his family actually runs a photography business, and he has used Signiak to organize photographs from one of their photo shoots. So with that, I will hand it over to Kelly, who's going to tell you about using our software stack for studying quasicrystals.
I can't share my screen while you're sharing.
Yeah, I'll stop sharing real quick.
So today I'll be talking about my project on merging and quasicrystals. And just thought this was a good example of how you can use Zenyac community to throw together to sweep a really large data space. So just to get an idea of what these simulations look like, or at least mine specifically, this is just a top-down view of the simulations. So all of the blue you see here are these particles that are free to move about in this periodic box, and they're all interacting through some pair potential. This little lighter spot here you see is a seed, and so this is what a close-up view of it looks like. They're just particles interacting through the same pair potential with some fixed position. So then there's a second seed here where I move it across to some distance, and then I rotate it. Then I run my simulations and see, so these two seeds will bias how my two crystals form and see how they interact and see if they form something called a grain boundary or not. And so our work was inspired by our collaboration with the Shahani group, where below here is an experimental result that they got running the same sort of crystal that we grew here in simulation. So I have an arrow here pointing to this little groove that formed between two crystals as they're growing. And it forms this groove that forms, which is the grain boundary that I'm talking about. So they found that for quasicrystals, they were less likely to form a grain boundary. So here's an example of a coarse grain simulation after I ran all the analysis, cleaned up all the data, and then spatially binned it, where the blue shows alignment with one of the seeds and orange shows alignment with another seed. So as you see, as they grow together, and the white is a fluid. So you see as they grow together and they collide, they form this same divot that they observe for samples that form grain boundaries. But as it grows, the divot kind of goes away, and then the orange side where the seed had biased it to form with the alignment of that one is slowly changing blue until the whole crystal is kind of blue and there's no grain boundary. And so the point of our research is to kind of see at what threshold of misorientation and distance do you get a single grain versus a grain boundary to form. This is also dependent on other parameters like temperature and pressure. So this is kind of a large data space. There's a lot to see. There's a lot of little pieces to look at, which means that this could get pretty difficult pretty quickly if I wanted to just make a hierarchical folder system to manage everything like Tim mentioned before. So instead I use Zenyac. So it's pretty easy. You can write an initialization script and predefine all of the parameters you want, and it'll actually automatically generate a file like this in a special folder with the job hashes, and it organizes everything very nicely for you here. So aside from something like distance and angles, which I'm changing for my simulation, I also store some parameters that I might want to go back to later, or at least just for the sake of transparency, people can see how I ran the simulation. So here, for example, I have initialization and final crystallization temperatures, simulation pressure, as well as a potential file. It's helpful here because the pair potential that I use is actually generated based on a previous paper where in the supplemental, there's a lot of different pair potentials you can choose from. So I've saved the exact file name. And so that way you can go back in, download the file, rerun it yourself, and you'll know exactly what data you need. Or you could go back in and change temperature, pressure, distance, create a new job file and run very easily. So the other thing is that because all these parameters are stored as metadata, you can easily access this for your actual simulations and then put them in as variables. So for example, there's a job class when you use Zenyac, and within this job class, you can access each state point. So you can see here that I've accessed the exact keys that were stored in the file previously, and this will use the values that you stored for your state point into each function where you call the job. And so this is really helpful because you don't have to worry about manually entering in information for each set of parameters that you want, and you can avoid any issues with something like typos or just forgetting what you put in the past. And so here you can see that I use each of these with whomd together. So this is the pair potential file that I've saved as a state point, and I use it as a parameter in whomd to specify how all my particles are interacting. Here you can see temperature and pressure with whomd, and that just specifies what kind of an environment my simulation will be running in. So once I have all these parameters saved and I'm set up, I can put them into one of my Signiak Flow projects. So Signiak Flow lets me create these multi-step simulation workflows. So for my simulations, I need to set them up, I need to run them so that all my positions are random, and then I need to actually compress and freeze everything so that my crystal forms. Signiak Flow lets me tell I can tell Signiak Flow that I want them in a specific order as well, so I don't have to worry about manually telling it to send my jobs in with this order. So how this looks in my code exactly is it's really just a set of decorators that you put over a function. So there's a class with the Signiak Flow called the Flow Project. And so in this project, like I said before, you can tell it which order you want your operations to go in, but also like the first decorator, you can tell it that a certain function is an operation. So that way, inside your script, you can still include any sort of helper functions, like some sort of special fitting analysis, but not have it run as its own step in your workflow. The second operator I have here is post-condition checkers. You can also have precondition checkers. This one here checks to see if you created a file after you ran the operation. And this is super helpful as well, just to make sure that it was complete and you got the things that you wanted from running an operation. And the final one is a context manager with Zenyac Flow. So this tells the computer that this function you wrote is within the folder of the job. And this is really helpful for something like generating data. So not all my data is generated directly through Signiak, and instead, whomd will create simulation files for me, save them with all of the relevant information. And so because I'm working in this job context, it knows to automatically save any of my files to the correct folders. And so I've worked on projects in the past where you have to remember to manually change the file path. And if you forget, you accidentally overwrite all the data that you spent so long running, or you put the wrong thing in, and then you get an error after running everything. And so this is just super helpful to be able to do. And then you can also do something like metadata. So for my analysis and for my simulations, I can record progress. So that way, if you have some really long analysis and then you stop halfway through, you can restart it without rerunning the entire analysis and actually just pick up where you left off. Or it can also tell Zenyac to just skip that step because you already completed it. So once all of this data is generated through simulation, I can then run it into my second step for analysis. And I can take any data that I generated and saved in the job folder, as well as any special state points that I've specified, and feed it into my analysis. And so my analysis step follows some of the same patterns. It's got multiple steps to it. And then instead of whomd this time, I'm using Freud, various other packages we've written in our lab, as well as some well-known ones like NumPy and SciPy and Pandas. Data from there is generated and stored using a Signiak managed interface for H5Pi or H5 store files. And so these, once again, automatically save everything in the correct spot. And I find that using H5 store is very useful because you can use human readable keys as well to store your data so that when you go back in the future, or if a collaborator wants to go back and look at it, it's fairly clear what you have stored there and why you have it stored there. And so I use this to store any sort of intermediate data that I generate during analysis that might take a while, as well as any final data for plots. So one of the nice perks of Zenyac that Tim mentioned before is that it's pretty flat to navigate. So I have 6 systems tested, 15 more orientations, and 1 to 5 trials of each. If I wanted to do this in a hierarchical folder format, it would be a lot to go through. But instead, you can see here on the screen, I printed out just all the job hashes, and that's all the information code that you needed. So it is not human readable, but Zenyac has a really nice solution for this, where you can easily search. So you can see here, it's just a simple command line operation, where I can just find, say, I just want to know all the jobs that have a misoriented intent. And I can easily find that. Or because it's a combination of things, I can search multiple filters at once and just find the hash associated with the job that I want to look at or want to run a specific operation on. So at the same time, say you're working with collaborators and maybe they're not particularly proficient in Python or not too comfortable with command line, or they just don't have time to learn how to use Zenyac. So there's a function in Zenyac as well called view, where you can start out with a folder, Zenyac view, and it'll create a folder called view for you. So this creates a dynamically linked view that'll organize all of your files based on the state points in like a hierarchical structure. So you can see here, if you go inside, you can see, for example, which trial I've run. You can pick from which trial you want to look at, which angle. You can see all the different angles in it, pick one. And so if I wanted to do this regularly while I'm running data, it's a bit arduous to go through this every single time to get to where I want to go, but it is very helpful and easy to share when your data is stored like this. And the other nice thing is that view isn't just copying all of your data over into a new repository, but instead it's creating a view. So if you make any changes to the files, it'll automatically be reflected. And if you look at it, it doesn't take up any additional space, which is nice because some of these files can be pretty large and take up a decent amount of space. And so finally, I wanted to put a plugin for developing as a student and how it can be helpful for the individual as well as for the whole lab. So I find that normally when I'm coding, it's by myself. You don't really get like a super close code review. Maybe you ask for help here or there and they'll take a glance. But if you need a feature that you think that other people need, so you could pull in a pull request. So this example for Freud, where you can see that if you make a pull request and you create a feature, you get a lot of feedback. And that's just not something you get. And so that's really reassuring for the code that you're using from these packages, as well as from a personal standpoint to know that what you're writing is really robust and correct. Through all of this, I've learned a lot about how to make sure I document my code correctly, put in strings to describe all my functions, name things consistently and understandably, and also just little things like organizing the code and little choices you might make during calculations that might decrease the reproducibility of your code. And so I think that developing has actually helped me personally become a better coder, as well as helping the whole lab. With that, I wanted to switch off to Alan.
All right, sharing my screen now. So can you guys see my slides?
Yep.
All right. So now I'm going to talk about our efforts to compute the phase diagram of a system of binary colloids. So we've talked a little bit about MD simulations previously. A common problem is that binary systems, when you have two types of particles, they tend to form like a glass-like phase, as shown by this amorphous looking thing on the bottom left right here. However, a recent observation of ours was that if you run the system at a low temperature for a specific type of interactions, you can actually get a pretty nice crystal, as shown on the top right here. So my goal in this very short talk is to compute the theoretical phase diagram for the system to provide like a theoretical understanding for this observation, and all the while pointing out how Glotzer group tools and other tools help me do this sort of calculation. All right, so as a brief review of thermodynamics, which a lot of the people in the audience probably haven't heard about since chemistry 2 or something. So we're going to want the Gibbs free energy of each individual phase to compute the phase diagram. This involves computing pressure versus volume data for each phase of interest, and then a reference Gibbs free energy for each phase of interest. And then with these quantities, you can compute the Gibbs free energy at other thermodynamic points using this equation over here with your reference data and then your PV data. So in total, we're going to need to run 3 different types of simulations. We're going to need to compute the reference free energy for the solid, the PV data for the gas, and then the PV data for the solid. And I won't go into too much detail about these types of simulations, other than they say they are fairly different, but I can run all 3 of these types of simulations within WHOMD Blue without much difficulty. So the way I set up my workspace is I split it up to where each Zenyac project has a specific operation, specifically those 3 that I was talking about on the last page. And so I have a directory structure that looks like this with 3 different folders in it. And then within each folder, there's a large number of state points. So for example, there's like 252 state points in this one, 10 in this one, and 36 in this one. And then as I mentioned before, there's 3 types of simulations with a slight sequence dependence on how I need to run them. So I split it up like this in part because this allows me to run all my simulations very, very easily on external clusters. So all I have to do is navigate into the specific directory, and then I just run python init.py and give it a random number to use as the random seed of my simulation. Then I run python project run-o initialize, which does makes a quick init file. And then I run python project.py submit with a couple options, which then actually produces the PBS scripts and then actually directly submits them to the cluster that I'm on. And so these commands are all actually within Signiak. And so these options right here, also Signiak has provided templates for each clusters to make providing these commands really easily. For example, this partition command, denotes which partition on the cluster I'm submitting to, and the W command specifies my wall time. And then Signiak automatically produces the script that I'm submitting. And so in general, these commands are all very similar between different clusters. And I like this in part because it makes reproducing all the data in my workspace pretty easily. If I was in an empty version of my Signiak project, I could just navigate in and repeat these 3 commands and then wait, for hundreds of GPU hours to pass by. So a lot of people in the audience are probably familiar with Jupyter Notebooks and how they can make our lives a little bit easier. So we can do all our analysis with Jupyter Notebooks, and makes it pretty easy, in part because of a lot of our data is visual, and visualizing everything helps us detect problems and make nice plots and whatnot. So actually a lot of our software is designed to work well with Jupyter Notebooks, like including Zenyac, the containers, Freud, WHOMD. In particular with Zenyac, I can actually iterate over any subset or all of my different state points in my Zenyac workspace pretty easily within a Jupyter Notebook. And then with containers, I can have a controlled Python environment with my Jupyter Notebook. And then some of the other nice advantages of Jupyter Notebooks is that you can be very transparent with how you're managing your data. You can produce nice final plots within the Jupyter Notebook, and then it makes it relatively simple to share and explain your methods with other people. So for example, in my case, this would be undergraduates and other graduate students that I've worked with a lot in the past. And then I think other people in our group should share them in examples on our websites for like different codes we produce. So I didn't explain too much about the process, but I was able to arrive at a final phase diagram for my system, which I'm showing on the right over here. So I've plotted lines of constant Gibbs free energy difference as a function of temperature and density. And so this star indicates where I previously observed a nice crystal. And so I find if I was to trace the constant density line up to higher temperatures, I find that the Gibbs free energy difference between my solid and my fluid decreases substantially, which I can actually interpret as the driving force for the formation of crystal has actually decreased significantly, which thus actually allowed me to understand why why I could see the nice binary crystal at low temperatures. And another thing I wanted to talk about was the extensivity of this project within a lot of the Glotzer group tools that we've worked with. If I was interested in looking at other densities and temperatures, other state points, I could pretty easily initialize just some new points within a Signiak project, Or if they were like very, very different and I wanted to work within a Signiak project, I could also pretty easily just start up a new Signiak project. And then also containers make it very easy to transport a lot of the work I've done thus far to like other clusters, for example. So I believe I first ran all the simulations for this project, but now I'm doing, you know, a very similar project on Exceed Comet and UMICH's Great Lakes with a pretty minimal effort. And then of course, if I change the system too much, I'll need to go in and change things around, like the Jupyter Notebook I've been working with. But in general, a lot of the tools we work with, like Signiak and HUMD, enable me to change to other systems pretty easily. The last thing I want to talk about is the reproducibility of the type of data I've collected by other groups. So in general, any MD code should be able to reproduce the sort of data I've generated here. There's a couple others in addition to HUMD out there, like NAMD and whatnot. And so by reporting the fits and reference-free energies, specifically the fits to the PV data and the reference-free energies for my system, in the final publication, this will actually enable others to completely reproduce the final phase diagram that I showed a couple slides ago. And then I want to mention that PV data is actually something that I've had to reproduce for other people's models on several occasions, where they might report a specific model for the type of particle in their publication. And then I find myself needing to reproduce some of the PV data that I know from their text they've probably already computed, but they might not have necessarily provided fits for. And so then I find myself doing something that they've also probably already done. And, you know, in fact, it's actually rather simple to report it. So over here on the right, I'm showing like an example table from a paper where people have reported their PV data. And these specific fits right here have helped me out in a research project I was involved with not too long ago. All right. So as a conclusion, us in the Glotzer group, we design software with and for the broader community to solve different research problems. Over here, I've got some logos for and images of a lot of the software that we have been directly involved in producing, as well as some of the software and groups that we are involved in collaborations with. All right, and I believe that is the conclusion of our talk, and we will take any questions.
All right, thank you very much. That was a great presentation. At this point, as Alan mentioned, we will be taking questions. There are enough of us here, I believe there's 30 or so people, that we probably should not just have people unmute themselves and ask questions. We could start talking over each other. Instead, if you have a question, if you go into your participants button at the bottom of your screen and click on that, there's a button that then says raise hand. So if you could raise your hand, I'd be happy to call on you and let you ask your question. Okay, I'm not seeing anybody raising their hand right off the bat, so I'll start with asking a question. So Joshua, when you started the presentation, you mentioned that prior to developing these tools, really the method was for students to develop code and then sort of hand it down to other students. And so I'm curious, you know, what the process was for making that transition from doing that sort of, you know, really individual focused method of tracking data or working with tool development into this larger, you know, lab-based community where you're developing the tools alongside the science and really looking at them as sort of parallel operations.
Well, it's been a long process. The one main thing that really got students interested early on at the time was the GPU capability of the code. That the code that was passed down was serial and it was very slow. And so by being able to run in parallel on a GPU, it was a big motivator to switch over to the new code and try and use it. But beyond that, as a motivation to get people to switch codes, developing the culture of open source software, good software design practices, has been a long process. So just you know, as I mentioned later in the talk about training new developers, every student that comes through our group, we try and teach them the development skills that they'll need to modify the codes and get them to do what they need to do for their research, and just encouraging the culture of open source reproducible software over the years.
Great, thank you. Other questions? Okay, well, I'll keep going with another question then if nobody else has anything. So you mentioned that others have adopted your tools and your software to for their own purposes in their own labs, and I think it was Tim who gave some examples on that. Can you talk a little bit about developing tools not just for yourself, but how others have wanted to work with you, and have they needed some guidance or help in terms of applying your tools?
Yeah, absolutely. So we try and develop our tools with as general and as an approach as possible. And so we leave, for example, in software engineering paradigms, we talk about object isolation, where each object is doing its own thing, and only by putting a bunch of them together as a whole do you create a simulation. And so our tools are actually designed to be a collection of these independent operations. And when a researcher comes to us and is excited about using our code, but they can't run their research yet because they just need this one more piece, quite often we'll work with them and point them to the algorithms that they should be using, and the files and the code that they need to be modifying and adding, and kind of walk them along that software development process that they may or may not be familiar with. And in many cases, these groups will develop a functionality that then when it comes out of that is actually a general feature on its own that's usable by others. And so they'll put up a pull request, and we'll merge it into Hundi or Freud or Signiak, and then those tools will have that functionality going forward for the rest of the community.
Okay, thank you.
So,
I still don't see anybody else raising a hand. Does anybody else have any questions for the team?
I could make a couple comments.
Sure, please go ahead.
Let me. Yeah, so I just wanted to comment that I think that, you know, participating in the development of open source software that is shared gives students and postdocs an opportunity to contribute to the scientific endeavor and have, you know, an impact on people in a way that's even more immediate than doing research and publishing a paper, which can sometimes take a long time to get through the process and get that paper out, and then you might give 1 or 2 talks on the work. Whereas, you know, developing a new module or, you know, a new feature in the code and then seeing a bunch of people start to use your code to do their research, I think is very exciting and empowering for students. And it seems like that seems to be a very, you know, one of the things I think that makes it popular and makes it easy for people to think in that way. It's certainly a difference over, say, when I first started here 20 years ago, when most people were using monolithic code bases, and there were a few standard ones out there and people were using them, or they, you know, we wrote all our own codes and never thought about how we would use them later after a student finished their dissertation and moved on. And so there was a lot of reinventing of the wheel, and we weren't writing code with the idea that someone else might want to use it. And I think that it's been this huge transformation in the group, due largely to Josh, and to you know, come here and show us how it's done. And it's really changed the culture of the group, and the way that now that we go about our science.
Yeah, I really appreciate that comment. I think oftentimes, you know, investing in data management and reproducibility can be seen as a chore. And so being able to point to places where students are benefiting and growing and developing their professional reputation is a really important avenue to consider in how you structure the lab and how you make that transition over.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about how your, you know, it might be that the science you do is impactful and will live on, but thinking about writing a piece of code that's like contributing to a scientific instrument that others can then use to do science that you never even thought of is exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a question from Robert Krasny. Are there any bottlenecks to running larger problems or using more complex interaction potentials?
I'll take that. So our codes are all built for high performance. So running large problems, it always depends on the definition of large. Somewhere there's going to be a bottleneck. We top out, there are some users of HUMD who want to push it and are pushing it up to billions of particles. That's a little bigger than it's really designed for, but it can be done. And as far as complex interaction potentials, we have, we within the Glotzer group use a lot of complex anisotropic interactions that are very expensive. This is not a problem within our code. If there are any particular, the code is designed in a very general way, so any interaction potential can be implemented, provided someone goes to the effort of implementing it, and it can feed into the system. And so but more broadly, our other tools, Freud and Signiak, are also designed with performance in mind. And so Freud uses extensive parallelism to do these analysis methods on the trajectories. And Signiak, even though it's implemented as a sort of as a database on a file system, it scales very well to tens or hundreds of thousands of jobs on these HPC systems.
Okay, we have about 3 minutes left, probably time for one more question if there is one.
I just put a link in the chat window of a paper that we wrote in the group a couple of years ago, how we think about when to write new code, reusable code, and like how to do it and when to do it and when not to do it.
That's great. I think that would be really helpful. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, please join me in thanking Joshua, Alan, Tim, Kelly, and Sharon. Thank you all very much. This is a great presentation.
Thanks, Jake.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Yep. Bye, everyone.